Right, compromise your
Okay.
integrity. I can do that enough for everybody, but are we live now, Linda?
Yes.
Okay, I think we'll start the meeting. Yeah. Welcome everybody to the June Schools Forum meeting. We are both in person and virtual, so we'll start with apologies for absence and substitutions. Could I just remind people of, before we do that, of some housekeeping, just whenever you're speaking, and to turn your microphone on, and for our virtual colleagues, if you're not being noticed, can you interrupt us if you want to raise a point? And if people could just announce themselves, at least initially the first time when they're speaking, that would be helpful. But we'll start with apologies for absence and substitutions. Cornelia.
Yes, good evening, everyone. We have apologies from Mia Pai, head teacher, Greenford High School, from Roisin Walsh, executive head teacher, Dormers Wells School, and Tracy Round Turner from West London College, Charlotte Hames, head teacher, Brentside High School, Dave Woods, head teacher, Beaconsfield Primary School, and also from Councillor Kamel Jits Korna Pal. Excuse me, we have a substitution also. We have Sarah Wilson, who is substituting for Sue Stanley.
Thanks, Cornelia. So the second item on the agenda is urgent matters. Anything to be considered as an urgent matter? No. Matters to be considered in private? No. Declarations of interest? Okay. And then that brings us to the minutes of the last meeting. So if I just go through them page by page, if anybody's got any comments or anything they want to note, please do come to raise your hand or raise your microphone. So page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, and page 6. Page 7, page 8. Page 9 and 10. And page 11 and 12. So I think we can agree to accept these as a record of the last forum meeting. No objections. Thanks very much. And thank you to Cornelia for putting together such great minutes. Yeah, very informative. Okay, if we quickly go through membership, I think we have a couple of vacancies still, Cornelia.
We have one vacancy in the primary schools category, and a vacancy for representative of non-maintained SEN providers, and also a vacancy for representative of staff nominated by recognized trade unions.
Was there a replacement councillor after Councillor Milliken?
Yes, we have 3 new councillors also. Councillor Kamaljit Kaur Nagpal, Councillor Hodan Hiley, and Councillor Andrew Steed.
That the vacancy, that wasn't correct about the vacancy about the trade union. That one is filled. It was the following line.
It was the following line. Sorry, you're right. Yeah.
So it's a vacancy in the VA and faith ethos section. That's correct.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you.
Just to confirm, I think because Councillor Nagpal is a cabinet member, she can't be on Schools Forum, but we'll clarify that outside this meeting. Thank you.
Proceed with the vacancies in particularly the maintained primary sector. Is that a vote? Is that a ballot? Or a nomination? Or either or both?
It's normally a ballot, but I think we're waiting to see, there might be another vacancy in the primary school category coming up. So we'll do both
Okay, well,
together.
Pick that up next term. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
So moving on to the main body of the report, I'm going to hand over to Kim and Tamara. They'll take us through the, oh no, sorry, apologies. We're going to start off with the audit report, which is Mike's report. Mike's going to take us through the audit report. So over to Mike. You want to just introduce yourself, Mike?
Sorry, I was trying to start my video so you could see me. Oh, there I am. So my name is Mike Pinder. I'm the Assistant Director of Audit and Investigation. I work as we work as a shared service with Hounslow. So we do not only your schools, but Hounslow schools. So the team gets loads of experience and knowledge about what's going on in the world. I'm hoping you can now see my slides on the screen. So I'm just going to run through the slides which you've already had in the very briefly. We're going to cover the kind of issues that we're finding as we come out and audit schools, of which we've done 17 this year. So I'm run through the governance issues, strategy issues, value for money, protecting the public funds, and then fraud stuff. So in terms of governance, the high level issues, governors' financial training. Often this is about lack of recording rather than it not happening. So just recording that you've trained your governors on finances. There was a question, sorry, I should have mentioned we attended the Bursa session earlier on this month. So this has probably all been implemented as they've come home and done it all. There was a question about whether that's all governors or just the ones on finance committee. Suggestion is all, so they can raise questions at the board of governors meetings and understand what you're presenting to them. Secondly, just around budget monitoring reports, again, often it's done. It's just about having the transparency and information and having behavioral support there to provide the response to questions. Private and voluntary funds, making sure that you get those independently audited and monitor them. And finally, declaration of interest, reminding governors that they need to do their declaration of interest, that they're recorded and that they refresh those annually. Moving on to kind of school strategy stuff, we quite often find that you have got schools development improvement plans, but it's not necessarily for the 3-year period recommended, and it's not necessarily linked to budgets. Business continuity, disaster recovery plans, let's hope we never need them, but it's good to have them there and try and think about what you're going to do if there is an impact on your site. Moving on to value for money, often benchmarking hasn't been done, and that includes the staffing and SLT level. Ensuring that head teachers' pays are within the permitted grade areas. I think the council can give advice on that where required, and making sure you tender for services in line with the appropriate authorisation levels and requirements. Sorry, I'm going very quickly. I'm sure you have questions if you need to. Protecting public funds, Paul's favourite, purchase orders. My expectation is that, you know, there is a materiality level. We've had feedback about, oh, what a waste of time, what a pain they are, and all those kind of things. I think really it's good to create that relationship with suppliers, and I'll mention a little bit on a fraud bit later as to why that can be quite useful. Bank reconciliations, again, making sure they're done, making sure they're signed off promptly. Again, there's some fraud risks that are quite prevalent now, and it's basically checking that your bank's telling you what you're expecting. Credit card reconciliations is something we regularly find, particularly head teachers would have an expectation that if a head teacher's credit card either goes to the Board of Governors or to the chair of the Board of Governors, ditto expenses. This was a slide that my team did unbeknown to me, and when they shared it to me, I thought actually it's quite powerful. So this is basically the 17 audits that we did this year. These are the kind of things we were recommending and how often we were doing it. So nobody was doing their account and card reconciliations, and all the segregation of duties authorisation was in place. Ditto purchasing cards, and quite a few other highlights. So just hopefully something to share with you guys, just to take away and check that you are doing. Fraud risk, I kind of wanted to go to this one because we've had a few live issues, and it kind of demonstrates why controls are necessary. So cyber ransomware, you know, if you're not expecting an email or it isn't what you're expecting, don't click on the links. We had a situation at a Hounslow school where basically a supplier sent an invoice. The head teacher's secretary was very helpful, sent it over to finance. Finance were very helpful, they paid it. It turned out it was the supplier's email had been hacked. They changed the bank account details. The school paid 15 grand for a new canopy so they could have the kids outside. Unfortunately, it didn't go to the right people. We couldn't recover that money, and they couldn't afford to get their canopy. So it's a case of that's where phishing is very prevalent. If they'd have used POs, it would have helped create that, make sure the supplier was set up, and tried and help to mitigate that risk. But again, it's kind of everybody was trying to be incredibly helpful, getting the supplier paid, but it's just a kind of example of what happens if the controls don't follow what should happen. Hope that makes sense. Checks I've got on there again, and the reason that bank reconciliations are so important now. It's all fabulous that our banks now allow us to scan our checks, and it makes it so much easier, doesn't it? The problem is that makes it easier if somebody gets access to a check or scans a check to tamper with it and then scan it in. Your bank reconciliations will tell you if that's happened. So if you're still using checks or you still have checks in the building, please do make sure you do your bank reconciliations promptly, because that will identify that type of fraud. Finally, just supplier collusion. It's just one of those things, I think, a regular reminder as staff build up relationships with suppliers. There's always a risk that creates an opportunity for them to commit fraud against you as well. So just keep an eye on some of those contracts. Make sure that people are it's in line with what you're expecting. Finally, if you do suspect fraud or you have concerns, contact the fraud team, and the contact details are there. Finally, my annual nag, please do complete your SFVS returns by the 31st of March. Regularly have to chase people and remind people, and they should have been signed off by the chair of the board. So make sure you kind of allow the lead in time for that. and they can be submitted to the email address on there. I hate saying FVS, so I won't say it again too often. And also, just to say, if you've got any queries or stuff as you go along, there's my contact details. If it's kind of policy setting, you're better going to the bursarial support team or the schools accountancy team. If it's kind of compliancy bits and pieces, we're always happy to help, and I'm sure most of you know Antonia and Julie who do the audits now. You can contact them directly as well. Any questions?
Hi, Mike Cassidy, Primary Schools. Some of the areas you discuss are quite complex, for instance, disaster recovery. Is it the expertise in your team to guide schools for those areas?
The team can kind of give you a bit of advice. It's not, we're not there to unfortunately set those things. There are, and this was asked by the bursarial team, but bursarial teams, when I presented to them, there are forms available and standard templates, and that's been circulated. So hopefully your bursarial team or admin team or whoever it is that leads on that will have got that, and that'll give you an indication of those. I'm sure you could probably also ask colleagues if they've got one or done one, if they can share that to give you an idea. I'm sure it's better to do that kind of thing rather than reinventing wheels. So I guess if anybody's got a really good one that they're really proud of, they could always share it from that as well. Unfortunately, we can't do it all for you, but we can kind of sometimes tell you who's got a good one or something from what we've seen, and those forms are available.
Thank you.
Just a quick one. On the matrix, sorry, in Buchanan Special Schools, on the matrix of things that you found, and some of them clearly there were 5 that were over half the school. I'm assuming that means there was an occurrence of those things rather than they were necessarily widespread within those schools. It only needed to happen once and it would end up ticking the box. Is that right?
Yeah.
It's not quite as bad as it looks if you're reading it.
Yeah, I think that probably is fair to say. It's kind of where we've issued a recommendation rather than whole scale. And but we do find we've had certainly one instance, and I don't think it was an Ealing school, where they just don't raise purchase orders at all, and then it's the kind of minor instances of non-compliance. And like I say, materiality is very much key to me. I understand that raising a PO for a packet of polos isn't necessarily on the top of your list, but as you get higher and higher up the list, creating that relationship is just so important, because for the kind of fraud risk that I've set out. So do talk to the team about kind of where they feel it should be there if they're raising those kind of issues. And I think also, if you're making a decision not to use purchase orders on those, making sure you've agreed at the board of governors so everybody's understanding of the risks and the position that you're at. Thanks.
Jeremy Hannay, Three Bridges. Sorry, Mike, is it possible, I just was looking through the document pack and I didn't see a copy of the slides. Is it possible for us to get a copy of these slides? I think they were quite informative.
Yes, of course.
Thanks.
Jeremy, they are there as Appendix 1.
Apologies.
Report, so it's page 35 of the report.
Sorry, Kim. Thank you very much.
Okay, if there's no other questions, I just want to thank Mike as ever for his work, which is always holding us to account. Thanks, Mike. I think you deliberately coloured in those bar charts around purchase orders deliberately. But no, great.
Just for you, Paul.
So thanks, Mike. You're very welcome to stay for the whole meeting, or you're free to go. Serve time early.
Okay, thank you very much.
you.
Cheers.
Thanks, Mike. So, in terms of the report, Kim and Tamara, I think you're going to go through the recommendations.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Paul. Evening, colleagues. So at the summer meeting of the forum, the local authority updates forum members on school balances and individual school outturns, the overall dedicated school grant outturn, and the various blocks of the grant. We also provide updates about kind of pressure and around high needs block, and then future decisions that are due to be taken by the forum in the November and January meetings. So that's set out in the report. In terms of the recommendations, we'll take recommendation 1 for decision and recommendation 2 for noting. So that's the decision about whether or not to apply the school balance mechanism, and the recommendation to note the level of school balances across Ealing schools. So Kim will take you through some of the detail of that.
Thank you, Tamara. So looking on page 18 of the report, section 4.1 sets out the level of school balances at 31st of March 2022. So those provisionally totaled 20.2 million, which was a decrease of 2.3 million on the previous year. And it sets out in the report the numbers of schools who've increased, decreased, close to the surplus. So 25 schools increased their balance this year, and which a third of schools, 2/3 saw a decrease in their balances. Section 4.2 then sets out around the excess and deficit balances. So in terms of deficit balances, there were 7 schools in deficit at the end of 21-22, which compares to 5 at the end of the previous financial year. And that was 5 schools that were previously in surplus coming into deficit, 2 schools moving from a deficit to a surplus, and 1 school coming out because of a merger with a junior school. So that school closed and is no longer a maintained school. In total, the deficits totaled 0.87 million and ranged from 0.02 million to 0.28 million. And the report sets out the local authorities monitoring requirements and support around those schools, and that sets out that the local authority will request an in-year budget monitoring return from maintained schools in the autumn, and report an in-year forecast position to forum in January, which is something that forum members requested would be helpful. In terms of excess balances, so the report sets out that of the 76 maintained schools, 37 had an excess balance, which is considered to be, so the reasonable level balance is considered to be up to 8% of the budget for nursery, primary and special schools, and 5% of the budget for high schools. So anything above, any schools above that would be classed as having an excess balance. So 37 schools, that's 1 nursery, 29 primary, 4 secondary and 3 special schools. The report sets out in appendix 2, which is on page 41. It has the extract from the Scheme for Financing Schools, which is the extract about the balance control mechanism that's within the scheme. And the decision for forum members around this is the decision as to whether to apply the balance control mechanism on the excess balances for 21-22. So moving down to section 4.3, just on the bottom of page 19 and 20, sets out, and the report sets out that the mechanism was applied last year, and it resulted in 10 schools being subject to clawback totaling 0.224 million, with clawbacks ranging from £2,000 to £75,000. Of those 10 schools that were subject to clawback in last year, 9 of them continue to have an excess balance, so above the 8% or 5% level, but all reduced their balance in 21-22. So would no longer be subject to clawback under the proposed mechanism for this year. There would potentially be 5 schools subject to clawback on the 21-22 balances, using the 3-year review period that's set out in the mechanism, none of whom experienced clawback last year. Appendix 4 in the report, which is on page 45, 45, has details of those schools and illustration of the provisional clawback values. So we're asking school forum members to consider whether to apply the clawback mechanism and agree that the resultant clawback funds can be used to support high needs pressures and other potential pressures related to future school organisation changes. And the recommendation is it would be around using the same mechanism as last year. So considering only those schools who've had the increased excess balance over the 3-year period, and would result, based on the illustrations, up to 0.26 million in clawback. Following forum decisions, so if forum are minded and do agree to implement the clawback mechanism, the schools council will be required to undertake a review of the school balance forms in terms of the earmarked revenue contributions to capital schemes, ensuring that spend under the accrual limit has been taken into account. So those are just sort of illustrated figures based on the outturns at the moment and could change based on that. So yeah, that's the sort of decision for forum members to make, is whether to apply the mechanism.
So are there any questions, first of all, technical questions anybody want to ask before we agree or not agree to apply the clawback? Ian?
Just thinking back to what you said about what happened last year. So on the basis that there were, I can't remember how many you said, but how many of those were not eventually clawed back because they had a story to underpin why they had the excess balance? And do we believe that most, if or all, of the ones that are on this year's list of 5 are likely to also be able to cover their position with a good plan to spend the money?
So it was 10 schools where we actually implemented the clawback. I believe last year at this stage there were 12 or 13 schools on the list. So there were a couple of schools that did that we didn't end up moving forward with the clawback mechanism. There were also some reductions in the amounts that we clawed back based on the review of the balance forms. But yeah, we're going to have the clawback on this 10. In terms of this year's clawback, so they're currently based on the outturns, but there's already been a consideration of the accruals within that, which has already taken a couple of schools off the list of potential clawbacks. There is one school on the list with a substantial surplus balance, and while we're not preempting the outcome of the review, that's a school that's having a large capital project, and we'll be making a contribution towards that capital project. So there's that may well be taken into account in that.
I think we have a mechanism for ensuring that we don't unduly penalise schools, and so I would support, I don't know whether all would, but going ahead with these, doing the review, and then we'll trust officers to come up with an effective mitigation where they think it's appropriate, would be my take. Thank you.
Does anybody want to raise any other issues with regards to clawback? Essentially, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, we're talking about 3 schools now?
It's 5 schools.
But you said 2 of them already have
Sorry, no, that was
fallen out of, or was that?
That was before
7?
we got to that.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's 5 schools.
So unless there's any disagreement or dissension, will we agree to apply the clawback? Yep. Agreed.
In terms of the mechanism, the other thing we wanted to ask forum about was in terms of the mechanism that we use within Ealing. So currently the mechanism has a 3-year review period. So schools with significant excess balances that have reduced over one or both of the past 2 financial years would not currently be considered for clawback. So we're asking forum members to provide feedback on whether they're happy to continue with that approach, or they would want officers to model an updated approach, and if so, what the features of that might be, if there's something forum members would like us to look at.
Any views on that? I think it might be, sorry to give you a bit more work. I think it would do no harm to at least provide a refreshed model so that there might be at least some element of discussion, because I think it's always good to keep this rather than kind of stagnate in the issue. So if everybody's agreed, if everybody's okay with that, don't want it to be sorry, it's not up to me. My suggestion is it shouldn't be an elaborate thing, but maybe just pick 1 or 2 points from the protocol and suggest what the difference might be if we changed it. And then if we brought that back to the November one, is that okay with everybody?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep. Paul, sorry, John Hicks from Pupil Referral Unit. On a similar theme, I'm not sure whether it's exactly what you're suggesting, but it would seem to make sense to look at maybe 2 continuous years in terms of the modelling from my point of view to see that and then see what impact that would have.
Okay, so the next recommendation that we're going to cover is item 3 for recommendations for noting. And Kim's going to give us an update on the national funding formula and the consultation that is attached as Appendix 5.
Okay, so at the April Forum meetings, this section of the report starts on page 21 of the report. So at the April Forum meeting, the local authority reported that the government had published their response to the consultation and confirmed that the national funding formula would remain a soft formula for 23-24, but the local authority would be required to move closer towards it. That's not something that would impact on us in Ealing, because we are already substantially at the national funding formula with just some minor changes for affordability. But in June, the government had published a further consultation that's just been published a few weeks ago, which is more about their approach to implementing the national funding formula and covers a number of sort of different areas within it. So it's not about the whether or the when, it's about how the funding formula will, how certain areas of it will or could be managed. So I've just, as Tamara said, in Appendix 5, there's a list of the 25 questions that are set out within that funding consultation, but we've just pulled out some of the key areas from that into the report. So the first area is around the interaction between the national funding formula and funding for high needs, including the flexibility to transfer funding to the high needs block from the schools block, and also whether to set an indicative notional send budget, whether that should be set nationally. The consultation does confirm the intention to allow block transfers under the hard national funding formula, but proposes that local authorities would be required to submit evidence of need and intended usage to the Secretary of State, who would be the final decision maker. So that would be a change from the current process when Forum agree that block transfer. So the recommended or the proposal there is that would be have a more stringent check, and the Secretary of State would make that decision. Some of the questions are around the growth fund and falling roll fund and how that could operate under the national funding formula. So the government's preferred approach is to allow some continued flexibility in how it's distributed, but with significantly greater consistency than the current system. And there is a suggestion that those changes could be implemented in 24-25. So they may be implemented earlier than the full implementation of the national funding formula. And there may be some risk or implication around that in terms of how we can and can't use that growth fund to manage pressures going forward. There's some questions in there about how the split site funding might work. So a proposal for a 500 metre minimum. At the moment, local authorities set their own split site criteria. So there are 3 schools that currently attract that funding. It's a relatively small amount, it's £53,000, but 2 of those schools wouldn't attract any funding through that if that proposed criteria is agreed. And then there's a section on how the minimum funding guarantee, which protects schools against excessive in-year changes to their per pupil funding, could continue. So it's currently set at 0.5% in Ealing, and only 2 schools funding rates were uplifted through that protection in 22-23. And as Ealing's already operating close to the national funding formula, that's not likely to have the risk around that's quite small, and any further protection is likely to be more around significant demographic changes than anything to do with formula changes. And then there are some questions about the funding cycle and the timeframes for that. So as I say, Appendix 5 sets out those questions, and it would be helpful if Forum have any feedback on, because the local authority will be responding directly to the consultation. Schools may also respond on their own behalf as well, but it would be helpful for any comments from Forum as to any of those areas to inform our response.
Anybody have any views on the consultation? I think colleagues would be very glad for you to feedback. Can I just ask a question with regards to the movement between blocks in the consultation? Is there a parameter set? Traditionally, we've transferred 0.5. Is there a parameter set for that type of transfer? I mean, it's interesting that it says consultation confirms the intention to allow block transfers under the NFF. Is there any indication that block could be 0.5, 5%, 10%, 20%? Nothing, no parameters on that?
So I'm not aware that they've announced any parameters on that. I'd imagine they'd need to find additional funding if they substantially increase the percentage that would be allowed.
So is the response, sorry, is the response to this just an in principle a view of whether you agree your view is to allow transfer between blocks?
So it's more around so that it's whether we're allowed to transfer and how we might go about doing that and how it would interact with the national funding formula. So if they set the funding formula, we're agreeing in Ealing that we would like to be at the national funding formula. How does that work? Because ultimately you'd have to be funding slightly below the national funding formula to free that funding up. So there's no indication that the percentage would necessarily change. They may allow greater flexibility or less flexibility. But I think we'll need to wait for the consultation outcome to understand how that would work.
And so they've effectively said that their proposal is that there be a sort of short menu of options in terms of those block transfers, and as I said, the proposal is that it would have to be, we'd have to set out the intention for use and have that agreed.
Could I pick that up? So this smacks of control freakery from the centre, doesn't it? Because I don't think I'm hearing there's likely to be any more money coming out. They just seem to want to limit what we can do with the resources that we've got. In the past, we've taken more internal decisions, within the local authority, within Forum, etc., where appropriate. And they now appear to want Secretary of State to get involved, or a team of people somewhere, for something that you would think would be in the noise for them. Do we know why they think this is a good idea? To put more controls on local authorities to fund their schools most effectively?
I think to some extent, the introduction of a hard formula potentially creates greater issues in areas where there are already agreements taken locally. So in Ealing, each year Schools Forum consider whether or not to agree the transfer, and historically have. Doesn't mean to say that you'll necessarily agree it going forward, but we'd hope that you would. In other areas, that's not the case. And so there has to be some small degree of flexibility, because potentially they're withdrawing funding by implementing a hard formula that's already agreed and it's part of the local approach. And they don't want to disadvantage other areas that have historically taken different decisions. So I think they've got themselves into a bit of a corner, and they're trying to find a mechanism to enable some local decision making while also having a hard formula. But it's not entirely clear how it would work practically speaking, because there are currently mechanisms to say appeal to the Secretary of State for various things, but the threshold is so high that the reality is it's quite rare to overturn local decisions that you've not managed to navigate and kind of agree an approach with schools.
Any other views? Any other comments, views? No? Thanks, Kim. We moved on to 4.
Okay, so this section, so there's no specific decision making now, but it's just to remind forum members of the decisions that will be coming up. Each year when we get to decision making rounds, there are different areas of particular interest for schools colleagues. It's helpful for the local authority to have an indication from schools at earliest stages possible about any significant changes to how forum are going to be minded to vote and the level of budget that will be able to be retained for services for schools. So the key areas of decision making, which we would likely be wanting to bring to the November meeting of the forum as far as possible, are around dedelegation, retained duties for all schools, general duties for maintained schools, historic commitments, and central schools block commitments. One of the key changes between years, forum members will remember, there was a reduction in the schools improvement grant between years, so it was reduced by 50% for 22-23, and for next financial year 23-24 the grant will cease in its entirety. And while the grant ceases, local authorities still retain the statutory duty for its maintained schools. And the report sets out the approach that's been taken to date to understand what support schools need. It sets out the value of the funding that is at risk, and it indicates the level of funding that would be required between the primary and high school maintained sectors to retain the level of service that is currently in place. I don't know, Kim, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, so that section is section page 20, bottom of page 23, and then through to page 25. And as Tamara said, we've set out the action that's been taken so far to understand the position, and there've been, since we last brought this to forum in April, there's been a further survey of primary schools, which has indicated a high level of support for schools forum to agree to use the top size through the education functions to fund the core functions, including the health checks and securing good programme. Although there's still some more work to do around the offer for high schools and how that's distinct from the offer that all schools get through ELP. Well, the report has sets out an illustration of what the per pupil rate required to meet the full 0.236 million funding gap would be £6.93 per maintained school pupil, and that would be as a flat rate across primary and high schools. Because there's 3 times as many primary school pupils as high school pupils, that would mean that primary schools were effectively funding 3 times as much of the gap as secondary schools, in line with the proportion of the pupils. And there's an illustration there in terms of what that would mean for some different sized primary and high schools in terms of the level of retained funding that would be. And Schools Forum members are asked to provide initial feedback on this proposed approach. So the options will be set out in the funding consultation in the autumn, and then it will come for an initial decision in the November meeting. But it would be helpful now if there is any feedback on the proposed approach and the rates set out to meet that gap.
Hi, Kim. Can I just check, has the questionnaire or the consultation that went out to schools been shared with everyone yet? Have I missed that somewhere? So the outcome of those which have kind of given the high level of, that's indicating the high level of support, is that being shared amongst schools forum or publicly?
So no, I don't believe that. I said that I know the recommendation, the feedback from that was discussed at the meeting with the steering group, which was held last week. I don't believe that has gone out further yet, but it will.
Is there a plan to do that before the consultation?
Sorry,
I believe
yeah,
that is
John, we could ask
intention,
Julie
yes.
to send that summary out. So if we note that in the minutes, Cornelia.
I think that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Gina.
Hi, Jamie Malloy, Grange Primary. Maybe an unpopular question here, but if the reports and all of the work into this is being done by Ealing, is there not a conflict of interest there that people will only be presenting the options that allow the highly respected staff to remain in post? And I'm just wondering whether there needs to be a piece of work done by someone independent who could offer other suggestions for Ealing moving forward that are different to maintaining the status quo, that doesn't have a personal stake in keeping their job, basically. And I think it's probably a question that needs to be asked at Schools Forum. I feel horrible saying it, but I think, you know, if you were to get me to justify why my headship was important, I could give you a million reasons, but actually someone independent might say, there's a better way. You could have an exec head from another school and get rid of Jamie. And I'm just conscious that this is a huge decision for us as a borough. Is it not worth spending some time to get some kind of independent views on what is the best model moving forward? Is the current school improvement model as effective as everyone's saying it is, or actually is there something that would cost us the same, cost us less, be more effective, etc., so that we're not accused of nepotism?
I think, I mean, Tamara and Kim can comment. Sorry, absolutely, it's good to have that challenge. Jamie, this is, I think you're probably talking about, but this is not the school improvement part of ELP. This is to do with statutory functions that had previously been funded through school improvement grant.
Oh yeah, no, apologies. That's what I mean. I mean the statutory functions, so like the health checks.
I suppose there is an evidence, a sort of a growing evidence base through the surveys, which do need to be published, and there will be another consultation. So I guess that would be the time for people to really comment on that.
But I suppose I'm saying is consultations say, do you agree this is good? And people go, oh, it's really good. I've used it. It's really good. But there isn't a consultation saying, well, actually, here's another, you could do plan B, that's been effective in these boroughs. How do you feel about that? Because we don't know what we don't know, and we've only had one model. And if there isn't a piece of work into what other models could work and be even better for us as schools, potentially, I don't know whether one does exist, but if we're not looking into that, aren't we being short-sighted by just saying, let's keep the statutory functions the same with the same people delivering them in the same ways, where we're not taking the opportunity to look at, could something be better or cheaper or both?
Yes, that those questions could be asked in the consultation. Do people want another scenario? So it'd be interesting to see what traction there would be for. So it's a point well made. Well, I think it's a point well made in terms of maybe asking that question as part of a further consultation.
Yes, so there is a schools funding consultation over the course of the summer that will include this element of funding. So all schools will have an opportunity to feedback. I think what it's probably important that we do between then and now is make it clear about what the statutory duties of the local authority are, because there are elements that are statutory and there's a limitation around the level of flexibility around that, and there's a degree of subjectivity about the bits that are more traded type services that are opt-in versus what is a core level of capacity that any organisation will need to undertake its duties. And that is a debate to some extent that's being had in the steering group. So the survey that's referenced, there was some more information in the April forum report around that. And that was, some of the questioning around that was about, you know, the various elements of a school improvement function that people valued for those that have been part of the Secure and Good programme, how they experienced that. So hopefully some of those some of that feedback has been gathered. I take your point about an independent kind of view on schools improvement. I think we'd need to have that conversation with Julie in terms of how to take that forward with school leaders. In terms of the kind of the hugeness of the decision, the education functions comes back every year for approval. So while we'd hope that schools wouldn't be chopping and changing, so ceasing a service, then later wanting it, or, you know, having it, but it's caveated that it's absolutely only a year. That's really challenging for us. There is an opportunity to continue to evolve the service to meet schools' needs. So it doesn't mean to say that there is, you know, there's no flexibility and we shouldn't be taking on board feedback on a continued basis. So you know, it's not a decision in perpetuity. And the actual value of the decisions that's been made, while I accept that, you know, every school's context is different and, you know, the level of commitment will have a different impact in different schools, we're actually talking about a relatively small amount of money in the scheme of everything that schools are committed to, and the local authority is committed to supporting schools around. And as you'll all know, the local authority is committed to maintaining schools on a continued basis, makes a contribution to help, etc. And there's a kind of fine balance between all of those elements of what are opt-in services and what is a core statutory function. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just trying to strike a reasonable balance that people feel broadly comfortable with. And that's all we can hope for, I think, really.
I just a couple of points. One clarification. So there's already an element of, but it's a different amount currently between primary and secondary. The plan is to go to a single figure for all, and it's increased from the April view of £6.81 to £6.93 across the board. So some bigger increase for some than others. What assumptions have been made, given that we are entering times where cost structures are going to be very different over the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and we're looking at next year? Have we assumed the sort of terribly bad news that is likely to get focused through the economy and the services that we need to provide, specifically in this area here, but more generally? Are those discussions happening? Because this could be in the noise compared to the trouble ahead from funding gaps going forward. And I don't know if this is really the right place to raise it, but I think for most people, it's probably a really big concern thinking about next year's budget, given inflation at 10, 11, 12%.
I think it's a bit of a difficult one to answer. So yes, everyone is almost watching this space, and the government will need to make whatever settlement it feels is appropriate, and will need to respond to that at that point in time. I think in a way this decision is a decision for maintained schools in the context of the white paper, in the context of the fact that schools have made a decision to remain maintained for whatever reason, and the local authority is committed to those schools. So irrespective of the broader, you know, utilities, cost of living, staff, inflation, etc., there is still a statutory function for schools improvement, and it needs to have enough capacity to be able to respond to schools, to, you know, proactively identify schools at risk and offer support, and also respond and react at points in time where that's necessary. And so we need to strike that balance and ensure that you have a high quality service. It is very lean, I'd suggest, in terms of we're talking, yeah, you know, kind of if you think about the numbers of staff that are in that service, this is relatively small proportions of individuals' time that, you know, on the balance of kind of a combination of traded services, schools improvement functions, help, we're not talking about a vast amount of capacity.
Does anybody else have a view that they want to share in terms of taking this forward? We've sort of had the comment about, but I suppose you'd have to think about that in terms of being a local authority function, the way Jamie described it, because it's not about a sort of optional school improvement model. It's about a statutory role, and then how the schools forum decide to support that or not support it. So it is a slightly different issue in that respect. And I guess the evidence gathered to date and the potential for more evidence gathering would be the vehicles that we use to get feedback. Any, Emma?
Hi, Emma Appleby, Horsenden Primary. I have well, what I would like to ensure moving forward is that we have absolute clarity that the people who are responding to the surveys that are happening have absolute clarity on what are the statutory functions and what are the non-statutory functions, because I don't have clarity on that. So therefore, I don't think that most head teachers do have clarity on that. And I think that what head teachers have already been asked was whether they support school improvement functions. And of course, head teachers support school improvement functions. Do they want to fund all school improvement functions moving forward in this way? That's the bit that I don't think head teachers have clarity on. Of course, they want to support it. And that's where I feel the very positive response is coming from. But there isn't that understanding of how it is going to be funded moving forward. I just think in the next consultation, we need absolute clarity on that so that we know and understand what we are responding to. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. It's helpful feedback.
Two core functions are the health checks and securing good program, which I think is 90%, 95% of that funding. So it has been, that was the basis of that survey, was to all the schools that had participated in securing good and health checks.
I think what I'm saying is possibly schools that have been involved in those would support them. Would schools who have not been involved in those be prepared to fund them for the very small proportion of schools who are involved in them? That's the bit that I don't think all schools, all primary schools anyway, have clarity on.
And so, yeah, that's come up as part. There have been very robust conversations as part of the steering group. So I wouldn't suggest it's in the steering group full of nepotism. And I do think that there's a principle here about, you know, as a group of maintained schools, is everything that's not the very absolute minimum chargeable at the point of access? And how do you maintain that minute core nub of high quality service without a guarantee around some elements that may be on the borders of what is directly a school's improvement versus a traded function? People have different views about which elements are statutory or not. There are always grey areas. I think continue to be challenged through that steering group around what is the absolute minimum and what might it look like otherwise. And I think it's something over time we'll continue to come back to. So irrespective of the decision you take this year, it's going to continue to be a discussion at the point you're making decisions about the HELP services, which is not this, it's distinct and different, but it's bound to come up at that point as well. And then when you're making the decisions in subsequent years. So I think it's not a static picture, but we do need to think as a group whether we think that offer should be available. It, you know, may be an outstanding school now, that may or may not be the case in future. We'd hope that all schools will be good or outstanding. But, you know, I think it has been a valued service from those schools that have been part of that programme. And there have been quite a substantial proportion of schools over that period of time. So each year it's about 8 to 10 schools. And there is quite a high turnover. So you don't see the same 10 schools for 3 years. You see schools progressing and moving out of the programme and new schools moving in. And they're not schools that are already in a position where they're RI. There are schools that are good who just need additional support to ensure that they avoid falling into RI at the next inspection.
Tomorrow, I don't know if this would be helpful or not, and I don't want to create unnecessary work, but I'm thinking about what some of the charges that academies as a whole might make, and whether there's a comparable thing that we could look at to make some comparisons between what the local authority is asking in terms of that small core team, what services they provide, and what that might look like against an academy kind of chain and what they might do, so that we get a good sense of what we're getting in terms of value and how the local authority is fulfilling that function versus that.
So in terms of information that's available, it's very difficult to unpick. So for the academies that are prepared to have a conversation with us about it, they charge 4 to 5% as a top slice across their schools. If you add up all of the top slices for maintained schools, including this, you'd be talking about 1% or something like that. So they are chalk and cheese in terms of the value that's been top sliced. But also the services that you'd expect, in an academy, a large academy chain, you have all of the functions and infrastructure of any school. You'll have a finance lead, a business manager or whatever. You'll also be funding a core finance function, which will be substantial in a MAT. And so it doesn't mean to say that you lose loads of costs because you're putting that 4 or 5% in. Quite a lot of schools that are part of MATs that take that level of top slice find that that's quite a pressure that they have to manage over time.
Thanks, Tamara. I understand how difficult it is to get hold of those figures. It's yeah, thank you.
Anybody else got any views or comments that anything from the secondary? Please, no.
I'm Marion Budd from Northup High School. We have not managed to meet as a maintained schools group to agree, but we've just been talking to Tamara about trying to make sure that we get some initial feedback to feedback to you before the consultation document goes out. So we're going to meet in hopefully this term, if not by the beginning of September.
Okay, so there's a little bit of a few things that have sort of come up from this discussion. One is to issue the summary to date of the feedback, and I think that would be a useful thing to do, is to look at the questions in the consultation to sort of maybe broaden those a little bit and ask for, is there a consensus for maybe a different view on this, and see what traction that comes back. But essentially, I guess by November, we need to take a view as a forum group to make a decision, because we'll have spent nearly a year or over talking about this, and it doesn't feel like a year. You feel like every time you come to it, it's new, but it has been quite a long process. So been a couple of really helpful pieces of feedback, which we'll take forward. And then they can't just look out for the consultation. I presume when you say over the summer, you mean the autumn?
It will come out. We have to write it over the summer.
Oh, you have to write it over the summer?
Yeah, it will
come out at the beginning of August,
consultation.
and the end of August.
The consultation will come out early in September, and we'll close in the middle of October. So it's a 6-week period from early September to the middle of October.
Yeah, also just to clarify, we're working to draft the consultation document over the next few weeks to give us an opportunity to share with our teacher colleagues some of the information that we're proposing to put out. So this kind of feedback is really helpful because we can work to make sure that that is covered off in the consultation document. Yes, as Kim said, it will actually be published in September. And we run a series of sessions as well for head teachers to attend. If there are questions about the consultation document, points of clarification, etc., And we can continue to have those discussions through schools consultative group and also the steering group as well. So there are lots of opportunities to gather feedback from head teachers. I think it's important to recognise that there isn't always consensus in some of the decisions that Forum needs to take. And so, you know, you can't please everybody all the time. And it's about the reasonableness of the decision and the evidence base for taking it, and Forum members feeling broadly comfortable with that. I don't think we'll ever get to a position where everyone's going to be agreeing on everything. So that might be something that we need to think about in the autumn term as we move into the Forum decision-making period.
Just one more quick question on that. Who is in the steering group and how were the members of the steering group chosen?
It was the steering group, if you remember, Jamie, members of Forum, head teachers of Forum were asked to put their names forward to be part of the steering group. So that's how the certain head teachers put their names forward. But all heads on the Forum members were invited to be part of that steering group.
And there's also head teachers representation from head teachers on the various ELP outside as well. So there's coverage of that.
Moving on, the other commitments, just to get a view that we're okay or not okay to continue to fund the other elements on the list, which is the dedelegation. Sorry, I've lost the page now.
Yeah, so the dedelegation items that were funded in 22-23 are set out in Appendix 6, which is page 49 of the report. And also set out there is the current reduction for education functions as well. So the line by line of that will need to be agreed. The funding consultation will set out the level of any kind of proposed changes and require feedback on any proposed changes to those. But yeah, any feedback at this stage on whether Forum are minded to continue with those or if they'd like to know any changes. And the other areas also set on page 22 are around the minimum funding guarantee, the growth funding, so some of the things we discussed earlier into the consultation, and those decisions will also be part of the funding consultation and decisions to come to Forum in November as well.
Views about those centrally retained and dedelegated budgets that we need to think about now, because there is a lot of work, preparatory work into if there's any kind of adjustment at all. It's like organizing the classes in school. Once one domino falls, everything falls. Anybody got any concerns or issues they want to raise? Otherwise, the officers will go ahead working on the models that they have. So this is the time to speak.
How consistent has it been year on year? We haven't changed it year on year, have we? We wouldn't expect to make. We wouldn't have expected to make major changes to any of these allocations.
I think there was a slight inflation. There was the issue the last time about slight inflationary costs, but
quite small,
they were very small to do with.
I just worry that we should assume it's probably 90% likely to be exactly as it is now, and that's the basis that you should work on tomorrow. That it makes it easier to, if we can at least give an initial steer that we're not expecting anything to be substantially different.
That's helpful. Okay, great. And
all right, so the next item is item 5 of the recommendations for noting, and that's an update on the early years block for the current year and next year. Paul is with us to cover that.
Yeah, thanks very much. Pardon?
Just here to quickly move through it.
I will go very quickly, Paul. Charles Barnard, Assistant Director. Yeah, I just put out the key points. I think I can do this in 30 seconds. So the funding for 2-year-olds is a straight pass through. So the money we get from government is passed straight to schools and the PVI, and it's gone up to £6.29. Similarly, with the disability access funding, that's been increased up to £800, which I worked out is about 10% rise. And the early years pupil premium has also gone up to £342. And again, all that funding just goes straight through. Probably more interesting is some of the headcount funding. So we're seeing a drop in birth rate in Ealing, and we're seeing a fall in headcount across all provision, probably around 3%. Is that right, Kim-ish? Okay, that's around 3%. It's not as dramatic as we thought following COVID. Sorry.
I just say, Charles, the headline in the BBC News around the census, was that in Haringey or some other borough beginning with H in the north, there was a 21% increase in population?
Yeah, I saw the national
Tower
figures
Hamlets.
is massively up. So it's quite interesting, Paul. So it's down for us. That's the latest, about 3%, we reckon.
Well, that was no overall population across Tower Hamlets. So the across most of London, the under 5 area certainly is decreasing, and there were actually some quite big variations in that across London in terms of ups and downs.
Thanks, Kim, for the support on the population stats. Moving quickly on. So, yeah, what is quite interesting is the proportions of provision take up. So I was talking to Tamara about this. So we're now at 51% take up within schools and 49% in PVI. And if you look at a 5-year change, that's very, very dramatic for Ealing. So that's on a cohort basis of about 5,700. That's about 1,100 more children going into the PVI sector for their early years provision rather than schools. So what we're seeing is some very dramatic changes in nursery classes, which you're feeling, but it's not really the population change, which is relatively small. It's this shift into the PVI sector. And we've done some unpicking of that, and we think it's linked to flexibility. So parents that are, on shift work or they're doing this virtual hybrid working or balancing 2 people working, they're looking for flexibility, and that's a real trend. And then we're kind of at that tipping point. There's only 1% between it, which is quite significant for a London borough, actually. So I just put that out there. We do consultations on an annual basis, and that's across PVI and schools. In Ealing, we have a funding formula that weights having a teacher in your provision, but going forward, as the tipping balance changes through that consultation, we might see the pattern of funding change over time to reflect that difference. So I just thought I'd mention that. Anything else that's a headline that's interesting? The other thing just to say is we've kept the retained funding for early years at the same level it was last year. You saw from the earlier conversation that has supported DSG funding pressures across the DSG 3 blocks. It's very complicated in early years because of the way that it's funded and whether we're in a falling role or a rising role, and that can affect how much additional money you need to draw on from contingency. So we feel that that's a fair setting of that amount, and it won't be lost to schools or the sector. It will come back to the forum to make a decision about if there is any left over, how that is used. Is that quick enough, Paul?
Thank you, Charles. Any questions, comments?
Yeah, it's Lindsay, the head in a nursery school. It was just really interesting what you said about that sort of 51%, 49%, and you mentioned flexibility, but is there any plans to ask parents what that reason is?
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. We're doing that right now. So we've got a childcare sufficiency piece of work, and we're out to consultation. And we're using, we normally get quite a really good level of feedback through that mechanism. And at some point, I'll definitely share it with early years sector. If the forum would like me to bring that as an appendices to here at some point in the future, always happy to do that. But yeah, that would tell us more. But we really do think it's flexibility, because when we brought the 30-hour, well, the government brought the 30-hour entitlement in, that's when we started to see the shift, and it sort of carried on from there, and the pandemic's probably accelerated it. So I'm happy to share that, Lindsay, back with you. And the other thing, as you're a nursery school, to say is the government have also given us the heads up that they're about to do a consultation on funding. So when we know more of that, we'll let you know. I think that's going to be in the autumn. They'd put in an interim arrangements through the pandemic for nursery schools. And when we know more in the autumn, we'll bring that back as well.
So we just turn your microphone on? If you could just tell us who you are, too.
Susan Dillon from Twinkle Tots Nursery. I could also sort of mention that flexibility for the uptake of 2-year-olds is about, it is all about flexibility. We have a lot of parents that choose PVI settings over schools because of the flexibility and the hours as well.
Just a quick question, Charles, as an outlier in this, does this affect schools' sort of intelligence around what children might come up? Obviously, if there's less children in schools' nurseries, did they rely on that sort of intelligence coming through that they're not getting now because more children are PVI?
It shouldn't do, because we've got the services that we go out to young children aren't dependent on where they are. So they should be known to early start health visiting in just the same way, whether they go to a PVI. In terms of transfer of information, that's something we need to continue to work on to make sure that that is good. We know that some PVI settings, Susan, are great and they transfer that to receiving schools. We know that others we need to work harder on to make sure that information reaches the right school. So yeah, it shouldn't affect, but in reality, there are some that are better than others. Yeah.
Sean, my life has just been transformed because I can move this forward. So if we just move on then to SEND sufficiency?
Yeah, can I just raise before we finish up? So the government's consulting, but the local authority will also need to consult on its local formula. That consultation will be separate to the schools and high needs block consultation that we've been talking about till now, because the timing of the government's consultation won't allow for us to include it. So there'll be 2 separate consultations, and it'll be a bit later in the autumn term. In terms of that drop in kind of demand in the maintained nursery classes, Kim and Sandeep ran a session for schools around kind of flexible offers, etc. recently, which was really well attended. And that's something that we can run again if there is, if schools would like for us to do that.
Okay, I think we're moving quickly on to SEND sufficiency. Yes?
Yeah, can do.
Or not?
Yeah.
So Charles Barnard, Assistant Director. So I'll we've obviously got the speed, and that's why I'm doing more. So a lot of detail came to forum last time around SEND sufficiency, and the work continues in terms of place planning. We continue to see the stats coming through for the summer term are following the pattern of previous years. So we've got quite an established pattern of rising need. And despite the slight plateau in the population, we are still seeing considerable demand for special school places. And there's a programme in place to sort of support meeting that demand. And so we will be sharing in the autumn a place planning document around SEND. We've consulted with schools around where there is voids and space in schools around possibly offering satellite provision as well. Am I going too slowly, Judith, or am I okay? It's just the time of the evening. I could be quicker, even quicker, okay. So that work is in process, and moving on to the special school descriptors, we are consulting with schools around that, and we will have that concluded, we're hoping, by the autumn. I'm just doing headlines now. We have a contain outbreak management funding for schools, and that's about 500k. That's involved a range of services that have been put in place. The appointments for those services are really only coming into place now, so really won't be felt till the autumn, and we will do a report back on those in terms of whether that's made any difference. And so the services I'm talking about are portage for very young children with complex needs, outreach services, and specialist teachers as well. So is that quick enough, Paul? Thanks.
Don Charles, any questions on sound sufficiency?
Sorry, Paul. I do just want to draw people's attention to the fact that the government's announced a new free school round for specialist places and alternative provision. And it's something that we'll need to consider along with schools around any bid. We are proposing to put an expression of interest in. So an initial kind of registration to express interest, and a submission would need to be in the autumn term, and that would need to be part of our broader sufficiency planning. They only announced it about a week or so ago. The timescales are very, very tight, and so we'll need to be picking up conversations early on in the autumn term with colleagues.
So are local authorities able to put a bid in for free schools?
Yeah, so what essentially the bidding process works in 2 rounds, so or 3 rounds. So there's an initial registration, which is, you know, probably for them to garner the level of interest and think about their own resourcing to assess applications. So that is in about a week's time, and it just says, you know, this is the local area, the broad range of need, potential age ranges, etc. So there's no firm commitment at that stage. In the autumn, it will need to be much more of a substantial bid in terms of having identified sites for possible locations, having partner local authorities, because these schools are not built just for the needs of one borough, they are regional. So you'd expect to be working to understand neighbouring boroughs' patterns of demand and gaining support from them for any bid. You can co-bid with a borough as well. So it could be that there's a location on a boundary and you want to do a joint bid with another borough. They really haven't left a lot of time to, you know, develop these strategies and cross-borough working. And so there'll be an element of cobbling it together, but I think we can all see that there's a high level of demand in the local authority, and the satellite approach that has been flagged by schools and we're taking forward is a short-term action which ultimately could result in longer term provision, but we still are concerned that if the prevalence continues to rise in the way it has done, even with those satellites, we may not have sufficient places. So that's the second stage, that's in October. After that, so any free school is an academy, and so at the point the DfE accepts your bid, they will go out potentially to the market to identify people that will express an interest in making that provision available. And so it's important people understand that dynamic.
But one thing they have said that local authorities will be asked to take a lead on the assessment of the applications to run schools in that area. So while it will be an academy, a free school provider, local authorities will be involved in the assessment of the applications to run a school in our area.
This is an academy chain to open a free special school. So it could be one of the high schools who are an academy could be a participant in that application process.
Yeah, and so it's a number of steps down the process. And there are a whole host of different types of organisations that may put themselves forward. But I think the important point is the point that Kim's raised. In the past, they haven't really engage local authorities in the process of identifying the provider. They might agree the provisions needed, but the local authority is not a decision maker in the process, but there's much more influence from the local authority in the DFE ultimately taking that decision. And as part of that, if we do have a bid that progresses to that stage, we'd want to be working with schools to evaluate the various hopefully a wave of appetite to offer provision in our area.
Great. And just in the medium term, it's worth noting that in gatekeeping, the expression of interest document went out for schools to consider whether they want to express an interest in opening either a unit or a satellite. And there's a deadline for that initial expression.
Yeah, so there's not a hard deadline, but it would be helpful to understand schools that have a genuine interest before the summer where possible, so we can begin to tease out which may be the viable kind of propositions that would warrant a feasibility and moving to the next stage. So if you are a school that has spare space or are interested in making provision yourself, then get in touch with either Tom, Lindsay or I.
And before we finish the high needs item, so the recommendation is that Forum note the forecasted growth, the overspends in the high needs block, the work the local authority is doing around sufficiency in places, outreach support, and provide feedback on whether Forum is minded to continue the 0.5% transfer from the schools block to the high needs block in 23-24.
Any comments on that?
Just to get back on the previous point about is the free school route the only growth route available now for additional capacity?
So an academy is still a government maintained school, and that is the only route to create new maintained provision that is funded by the government.
So there's no way Ealing can respond by saying we've got huge pressure, we need to have more resource. All you can do is work with the process to have additional interest in providing academy type facilities.
For a new provision, yes.
Yeah, you can grow existing, but not starting.
Yeah. And we have expanded all of our special schools, and there is a limit to the extent that you can expand any school. We're pretty much at the brink of any expansion.
But the satellite route obviously is something that's within the local authorities, the school's gift, rather than it being something that's
Yeah, just picking up on the point where it says the local authority would like to prioritise funding for outreach, increasing the outreach offer. Just to clarify my understanding, so like ASD autism outreach, for example, is funded from the high needs block. Is that right? So if there's an increase in the provision, it would be funded from the high needs block. So schools wouldn't see a change in payments as such. Whereas SEMH provision is funded as a de-delegation. So if we were to, for example, double our SEMH outreach, then there would be the costs would increase to schools. I just wonder whether are there any plans for that increase to be funded, for SEMH provision to be funded from the high needs block, for example, because the schools then won't see a direct increase on what they have to pay out?
Yeah, so it's not restricted to any particular needs type. It's based on the volume and level of need, and it needs to be informed by what schools believe would have the most impact. So it could well be SEMH provision. We've had conversations with a number of existing providers who offer outreach around how they could extend their offer, as well as new providers, and it's likely we'll send a note out to schools around expressing their interest to provide outreach to support school to school. Some of that could be traded as it is now, so a number of schools offer their own traded service, but it also could be a core offer that's funded on an SLA basis directly from the high needs block, so the LA commissioning a provider to offer an agreed level of support. The challenge is agreeing a referral route and making sure that we're clear about the impact and outcomes for schools and for individual children through that process. So we need to agree the best approach with schools to do that.
Thank you, everybody. We did very well. Just hang in there for the last few seconds. The SG outturn.
Thanks, Paul. So there are two items that kind of relate to DSG outturn. So in the recommendations for decision, the second item is a decision for Forum to take around the use of reserves, and item 7 of the recommendations for noting is to note the outturn for the DSG for the year. So if we move to page, towards the end of the report, page 28. The table sets out each of the blocks independently of one another. So each block is ring fenced, as you know, and so each block could have surpluses or deficits. So the high needs block, we started the year with a deficit. In the previous year, Schools Forum had agreed to apply unspent reserves in other blocks to offset part of that. And you'll see that there was an in-year pressure of 0.947 million in high needs. So overall, the DSG deficit reduced between years. So part of that is to do with the work that's set out earlier on in the report and what we talked about at the April meeting. And part of that is to do with the application of reserves between years. The early years block, again, started the year in a surplus. Schools Forum agreed to apply that surplus against high needs funding pressures, and that has happened in year. There was an in-year underspend, and that links to the contingency for the early years block. And Charles referenced that in his update on early years. There are timing differences in terms of the funding to the local authority and how that's adjusted based on actual pupil numbers. And so the contingencies agreed as part of the early years funding formula. And as you know, that will come for consultation with schools in the autumn term. So there was a reduction in the overall reserve between years. So from that 9.24 million, 0.924 million to 0.563 million. On the schools block, there was again a slight reduction in the overall reserve. That reserve is almost entirely built up of unspent growth fund historically, and so that is a one-off underspend. So the recommendation for Schools Forum is to apply each of those kind of surpluses, underspends on the early years block and schools block to fund high needs pressures, so the high needs deficit, to fund growth fund pressures in the current financial year. So we reported to Forum in January that the grant for growth fund was lower than the amount of commitment to the growth fund, so it would offset part of that. And then also to fund school organisation changes, and those changes are not individual restructures in schools, they are amalgamations of schools, closures of schools, etc. So this year we have an amalgamation of infant and junior school, so it'd be to fund costs in relation to that. And so that's a proposal, so that would be a decision for School Forum at this point.
Any comments, views on that? All okay to agree that? Yep. Thank you. That's very helpful. Just to say that despite robust conversations with Tamara and Kim about budgets, both in my own setting but elsewhere, I have to say that the management of the high needs block is by Ealing is incredibly well managed, considering what's going on nationally and the intervention powers that central government are doing with some authorities. So despite the fact sometimes it does feel a bit delicate, there's been really substantial amount of work to manage the high needs budget and the high needs deficit, and I think it's a great credit to us all collaboratively working together, but particularly being led by Tamara and Kim. So I think we should acknowledge that. So that's it for this evening's entertainment. Thank you very much for your attention and have a good evening, everybody. Deserve it, my God, you know, it really is a credit.